Mariel never believed in fairy tales, but if she had, this would be the worst one ever written. At 12 years old, she wasn't dreaming of castles or princes, she was too busy trying to survive in a world that had never been kind to her. But when a man in a suit knocked on her family's door with a contract in hand, her fate was sealed. She was to marry a boy she had never met. A boy with more money than she could comprehend, raised in a world so far from hers it might as well have been another planet. Theodore Winslow III was 12 years old, just like her. But unlike her, he had never known hunger, never wondered if tomorrow would bring food or just another empty plate. And unlike her, he hated this arrangement just as much as she did. As she stood at the altar beside him, staring into the cold blue eyes of the boy she was supposed to call her husband, Mariel made a silent promise. She might not have chosen this life, but she would not let it break her. And one day, she would find a way to take back her freedom, no matter what it cost. Mariel Ramos had never known a life of comfort. Born into a struggling Filipino family, her childhood had been shaped by hardship and survival. Her mother worked tirelessly, taking on multiple jobs to keep food on the table, while her father had abandoned them years ago, leaving behind nothing but debts and broken promises. As the eldest of 4 siblings, Mariel had learned from a young age that childhood was a luxury she couldn't afford. At 12 years old, she wasn't dreaming of toys or school dances, she was dreaming of finding a way to make sure her brothers and sisters didn't go to bed hungry. Their tiny home was barely standing, with patched-up walls and a roof that leaked whenever the rain poured. Every night, Mariel listened to her mother sigh in exhaustion as she counted the little money she had earned that day, trying to stretch it for another week. Mariel wished she could help, but there were few opportunities for a girl her age. She sometimes ran errands for neighbors in exchange for leftover food, but it was never enough. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a knock on their door shattered the fragile silence of their home. Mariel's mother wiped her hands on her worn dress before opening the door, only to freeze in shock at the sight of the man standing there. He was dressed in an expensive suit, his shoes polished to perfection, and his eyes cold and calculating. Behind him stood 2 other men, equally well-dressed, their presence intimidating in their quiet authority. "Mrs. Ramos?" the man asked, his voice smooth and businesslike. Mariel's mother nodded hesitantly, her hands gripping the edge of the door. "My name is Mr. Whitmore," he continued, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I am here on behalf of the Winslow family. They have a proposal for you." Mariel, who had been sitting on the floor playing with her youngest brother, glanced up at the sound of the unfamiliar name. She had never heard of the Winslows, but judging by the way her mother had gone pale, she understood that they must be important. Mr. Whitmore placed a folder on the small wooden table in the center of the room. "Your daughter, Mariel, is being offered the opportunity to marry Theodore Winslow III." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Mariel's mother visibly flinched, her breath hitching. Mariel herself didn't fully understand what had just been said, but the way her mother's expression darkened made her stomach twist. "She's only 12, her mother whispered, her voice barely audible. Mr. Whitmore remained unfazed. "And so is Theodore," he replied. "This is not an unusual arrangement among families of great influence. It is a legal contract that will provide security for both parties." Mariel's mother shook her head, her lips trembling. "I don't understand. Why would they choose my daughter?" Mr. Whitmore adjusted the cuff of his sleeve before answering. "The Winslow family requires a marriage that ensures stability but without the risk of financial or political complications. Your daughter has no status, no wealth, and no means to make a claim on their fortune. That makes her the ideal candidate. In return, you and your family will be generously compensated. Your debts will be cleared, and you will receive a monthly allowance to ensure a comfortable life." Mariel barely processed what was happening. She wasn't sure what scared her more, the cold certainty in the man's voice or the silence from her mother, who seemed to be caught between panic and desperation. "And if I refuse?" her mother finally asked. Mr. Whitmore didn't blink. Then your debts remain, and your situation does not change. But I advise you to consider what is best for your family. Mariel could see the war in her mother's eyes. She wanted to refuse, to protect her daughter from whatever fate this arrangement held. But she also knew that saying no meant condemning her children to more hunger, more suffering, and an endless cycle of poverty they could never escape. Tears welled in her mother's eyes as she turned to Mariel, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." And just like that, Mariel's fate was sealed. 1 week later, she stood in a lavish hall, dressed in a white dress that didn't feel like hers, staring at a boy she had never met before. Theodore Winslow III was just as reluctant as she was. His jaw was clenched, his eyes filled with resentment, and he made no attempt to hide his distaste for the situation. They were both just 12 years old, trapped in a world neither of them had chosen. As the ceremony began, Mariel clenched her fists and made herself a silent promise. If this was going to be her life, she would find a way to survive it. Mariel sat stiffly in the back seat of a sleek black car as it glided through the city streets. The buildings outside grew taller, shinier, and more expensive with each passing minute. She clutched the folds of her white dress tightly, feeling suffocated by the fabric, the silence, and the reality of what had just happened. She was married. At 12 years old, she had been tied to a boy she didn't know, a family that didn't want her, and a future she couldn't escape. Beside her sat Theodore Winslow III, Ted, as his parents called him. He had barely looked at her during the ceremony, standing stiff and resentful as they exchanged the vows written for them. Now, in the car, he sat with his arms crossed, staring out the window with a scowl on his face. "I hope you don't think this means anything," he muttered without looking at her. Mariel turned her head slowly, unsure if he was speaking to her or himself. Ted finally looked at her, his sharp blue eyes filled with irritation. "This isn't a real marriage. I don't care who you are or where you came from. My parents did this because they want control over my life, and you just happen to be the easiest option for them." Mariel didn't flinch, though his words stung. She had already accepted that she was nothing more than a convenient choice. But hearing it spoken aloud made it feel even more real. "I didn't ask for this either," she said quietly. Ted let out a short, humorless laugh. "Good. Then we agree on something." The car pulled up to the Grand Winslow estate, a sprawling mansion that looked like it had been taken from the pages of a magazine. Mariel had never seen anything like it: tall marble pillars, perfectly manicured gardens, and a fountain bigger than her entire house back in the village. The driver opened the door, and Ted stepped out first without waiting for her. Mariel hesitated before following, feeling out of place as soon as her feet touched the stone driveway. Inside, the mansion was just as intimidating. Crystal chandeliers hung from impossibly high ceilings, paintings worth more than she could ever imagine lined the walls, and the air smelled of something expensive and unfamiliar. Mariel barely had time to take it all in before she was ushered into a smaller sitting room, where Ted's parents were waiting. His mother, Evelyn Winslow, was a tall woman with sharp features and an air of authority. She barely acknowledged Mariel as she adjusted the bracelet on her wrist. Ted's father, Theodore Winslow II, sat in a leather chair, watching them with the same cold detachment as if they were business transactions rather than people. "You will be given your own room in the West Wing," Evelyn said briskly, her voice carrying no warmth. "You are expected to behave properly and understand your place in this household. This arrangement is not about you. It is about ensuring stability for our family's legacy. You will not embarrass us, and you will not interfere in Theodore's life beyond what is necessary for appearances." Mariel said nothing, keeping her face expressionless. She understood what was being told to her: she was here to exist quietly, to be an ornament in their world, nothing more. "Good," Evelyn said, seeming satisfied by her silence. "Your staff will show you to your quarters." A maid stepped forward, gesturing for Mariel to follow. She cast one last glance at Ted, who was already walking away in the opposite direction, then followed the maid down a long, dimly lit corridor. Her new room was nothing like the one she had shared with her siblings. It was grand, almost too much, with a four-poster bed, a fireplace, and a closet full of expensive clothes she had never seen before. But it didn't feel like hers. It didn't feel like home. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting on her lap, as reality settled in. She was no longer Mariel Ramos, the girl from the small village struggling to survive. She was Mariel Winslow, the wife of a boy who hated her, the daughter-in-law of a family that saw her as nothing more than a tool. She had no idea what her future would look like, but one thing was clear. She was alone in a world that would never truly accept her. The first few weeks in the Winslow estate passed in a blur of silence, cold glances, and unspoken rules that Mariel had no choice but to learn. No one explicitly told her how to behave, but it quickly became clear that she was expected to be invisible. The house staff spoke to her only when necessary, the Winslows never acknowledged her presence unless it was to remind her of her place, and Ted ignored her completely, as if she didn't exist. Every morning, she woke up in a room that felt too large, too foreign, with a bed that was too soft for someone who had spent her childhood sleeping on a thin mat on the floor. She ate her meals alone in the smaller dining hall, separate from the Winslow family, because Evelyn had made it clear that her presence at the main table was unnecessary. She wasn't part of the family. She was just a name on a contract, an obligation that they all wanted to forget. Ted continued to treat her with indifference, speaking to her only when forced. He spent his time with private tutors, learning how to take over the family business, while she was left to wander the estate, trapped in a life that didn't belong to her. At first, she thought she would go mad with the suffocating loneliness. But then, she found the library. It was the only room in the entire mansion where she felt at peace. No one went there except the elderly librarian, Mrs. Hastings, who had been with the Winslow family for decades. She was the only person who didn't look at Mariel like she was an inconvenience. Instead, she welcomed her with a kind smile and a knowing glance, as if she understood exactly why she sought refuge among the towering bookshelves. "You like to read?" Mrs. Hastings asked one afternoon as Mariel traced her fingers along the spines of the books, most of which had titles she couldn't yet understand. "I never had books before," Mariel admitted quietly. "Only what we had in school. But I like learning." The old woman nodded approvingly. "Then this place is yours. Come whenever you want." Mariel took her words to heart. She spent hours in the library every day, immersing herself in history, literature, and languages she had never been exposed to before. She taught herself English properly, memorizing new words and phrases, determined to speak fluently like the Winslows did. She studied business, law, and anything that might help her understand the world she had been forced into. If she was going to survive here, she refused to remain ignorant. One afternoon, as she sat at a corner table with a book open in front of her, she heard the door creak open. She expected it to be Mrs. Hastings, but when she looked up, her heart sank. It was Ted. He looked just as displeased to see her as she was to see him. For a moment, he hesitated, as if debating whether to leave, but then he sighed and walked inside. Without acknowledging her, he grabbed a book from one of the shelves and dropped into the chair across from her, flipping it open with an air of boredom. Mariel tried to ignore him, focusing on her own book, but the weight of his presence was distracting. She could feel his gaze flicker toward her every so often, though he quickly looked away whenever she caught him. After several minutes of silence, Ted finally spoke. "Why are you even here?" Mariel turned a page without looking at him. "Reading." Ted scoffed. "You can read?" Her grip on the book tightened. "I'm learning." He smirked, shaking his head. "What's the point? It's not like you'll ever use it. My parents don't expect anything from you. They just want you to stay out of the way." Mariel exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. She knew he was trying to get a reaction out of her. Ted might have been raised with wealth and power, but he was still just a 12-year-old boy, lashing out because he had no control over his own life. She understood that, but it didn't mean she had to let him belittle her. "I don't care what your parents expect," she said evenly. "I expect more from myself." Ted stared at her, clearly taken aback by her response. He had been prepared for anger, maybe even tears, but not quiet determination. He closed his book without reading a single page and stood up. "Suit yourself," he muttered before walking out. Mariel watched him leave, then returned her focus to her book. She didn't need Ted's approval. She didn't need anyone's approval. She had no control over the life that had been forced upon her. But she could control who she became. And she refused to be nothing. The weeks turned into months, and Mariel slowly adapted to her new life within the Winslow estate. The loneliness never truly went away, but she had found ways to cope. She continued spending hours in the library, reading everything she could get her hands on. Books became her escape, her silent rebellion against the world that had forced her into this unwanted marriage. She was determined to become more than just the poor girl who married a millionaire's son. Ted, however, remained a constant presence in her life, even if they barely spoke outside of obligatory encounters. He was still dismissive, still cold, but there were moments when he seemed almost curious about her. He would find excuses to be in the library at the same time as her, even if he never acknowledged her directly. Occasionally, he would watch her as she studied, his gaze lingering just long enough for her to notice before he quickly looked away. One evening, after dinner, Mariel sat by the large window in her room, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The estate was so far removed from the real world that sometimes she felt like she was trapped in a different reality altogether. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the occasional rustling of the trees outside. A soft knock at the door startled her. She wasn't used to visitors. No one ever came to see her unless it was the house staff delivering something. She hesitated before opening it. To her surprise, Ted stood there, hands in his pockets, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Can I come in?" he asked, his tone unusually neutral. Mariel narrowed her eyes. "Why?" Ted sighed as if regretting his decision already. "Just for a minute." She considered slamming the door in his face but stepped aside instead. He walked in, glancing around as if seeing her room for the first time. It was elegant, decorated in soft creams and golds, but it still felt impersonal, like a hotel room rather than a home. Ted moved toward the window, staring out at the same view she had been looking at moments before. "You really spend all your time in the library?" Mariel crossed her arms. "Why do you care?" He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't. It's just weird." She arched an eyebrow. "Weird that I want to learn." He turned to face her, something unreadable in his expression. "Weird that you actually think any of this will matter. My parents don't see you as anything more than a placeholder. You could spend the next 10 years memorizing every book in that library, and they still wouldn't care." Mariel's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "Maybe I'm not doing it for them." Ted blinked, seemingly caught off guard by her response. He studied her for a moment, as if trying to figure her out. "So why are you doing it?" She hesitated before answering. "Because one day, I won't be trapped here. And when that day comes, I want to be ready." Something shifted in his expression. For the first time since they had met, he didn't look at her with condescension. Instead, he looked almost thoughtful. After a long pause, he nodded slightly. "Good luck with that." Without another word, he turned and left the room, leaving Mariel standing there, her heart pounding for reasons she didn't quite understand. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she realized something. Ted Winslow might have been born into privilege, but in his own way, he was just as trapped as she was. And for the first time, she wondered if he hated their situation as much as she did. Mariel continued her routine of quiet defiance, spending her days in the library, learning everything she could about the world she had been forced into. She studied business, history, and languages, absorbing knowledge as if it was the only thing that could protect her. She knew that no matter how much Ted's parents looked down on her, intelligence was something they couldn't take away. Ted, however, remained an enigma. He still treated her with indifference most of the time, but there were moments when he seemed almost interested in what she was doing. He would walk into the library, pretending to browse books, but she could feel his gaze flickering toward her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Sometimes he would ask sarcastic questions, mocking her efforts, but she noticed that he always listened to her answers. One afternoon, Mariel sat at her usual table, reading a book on corporate law, when Ted dropped into the chair across from her without an invitation. He leaned back, stretching his arms behind his head, looking more bored than usual. "You know, for someone who's stuck here just like me, you sure act like you have a plan," he said, eyeing the book in her hands. Mariel didn't look up. "Maybe I do." Ted raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly is this grand plan of yours?" She finally met his gaze. "To be smarter than everyone who thinks I don't belong here." He stared at her for a moment before letting out a short laugh. "That's ambitious." "It's necessary," she corrected. Ted tapped his fingers on the table, as if considering her words. "You really think knowledge is going to change anything?" "It already has," she said simply. "I understand this world more than I did when I first got here. I know how people like your parents operate. They think power is about money, but real power comes from knowing how to use it." Ted studied her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You sound like my father." Mariel smirked. "Maybe your father should be more worried about that." Ted exhaled, shaking his head. "You're ridiculous. And you're arrogant," she shot back. He leaned forward slightly, his blue eyes narrowing. "At least I know how this world works." "So do I," she countered. "The difference is, I don't accept it the way it is." For the first time, Ted didn't have a comeback. He just sat there, watching her, as if trying to figure out how a girl from a poor village could be so sure of herself. The conversation should have ended there, but instead, Ted stayed. He didn't leave after delivering his usual smug remarks. Instead, he picked up a book from the table and started flipping through it absent-mindedly. Mariel tried to ignore him, but it was strange to have him sitting across from her without actively trying to annoy her. After a few minutes, he spoke again, his tone more curious than mocking. "If you weren't here, if none of this had happened, what would you have wanted to be?" Mariel hesitated, surprised by the question. She had never really thought about it before. Her life had always been about survival, not dreams. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe a teacher. Maybe a writer. Someone who gets to decide her own life." Ted nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yeah. That must be nice." For a brief moment, Mariel saw something in his eyes that she hadn't noticed before, something almost vulnerable. But before she could make sense of it, he pushed back his chair and stood up. "Good luck with that," he said, his usual smirk returning. "Not that it'll matter here." Mariel watched him walk away, but this time, she didn't feel the same frustration she usually did. Because for the first time, she realized something important. Ted Winslow wasn't just arrogant and entitled. He was trapped too. He might have had money, privilege, and a future already planned out for him, but in his own way, he was just as powerless as she was. And for the first time, she wondered if he resented it just as much as she did. Mariel had always believed that she and Ted existed in two separate worlds, forced together by circumstances neither of them had chosen. He was the privileged heir of an empire, and she was the girl brought in as a convenient fixture in his family's carefully controlled life. But over time, she began to notice things about him that she hadn't before. For all his arrogance and sharp words, Ted wasn't as indifferent as he pretended to be. He went through the motions of his life, attending private tutoring sessions, learning the ins and outs of the Winslow business, fulfilling every expectation placed upon him, but there was a quiet resentment beneath his polished exterior. His parents controlled every aspect of his future, just as they had arranged his marriage. The difference was that he had never known anything else, while Mariel had spent her childhood fighting for even the smallest freedoms. One evening, Mariel found herself in the garden, escaping the suffocating silence of the estate. The Winslow mansion was grand, but it never felt like home. The only time she felt truly at peace was when she was alone beneath the open sky, where no walls could contain her. She sat on the stone bench, looking up at the stars, wishing for a life beyond the one that had been forced upon her. She didn't hear Ted approach until he spoke. Running away? She turned her head to see him standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets, watching her with that same mix of curiosity and amusement that had become familiar. "Wouldn't I have to belong here in the first place to run away from it?" she asked, her voice calm. Ted smirked but didn't argue. Instead, he sat down on the bench beside her, surprising her. They weren't exactly friends. They barely tolerated each other most days. But lately, their exchanges had been different, less hostile, more like two people trying to understand something neither of them could change. "Why do you spend so much time in the library?" he asked, his tone less mocking than usual. Mariel hesitated before answering. "Because knowledge is the only power I have." Ted tilted his head slightly, considering her words. "And what exactly do you plan to do with all that power?" She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "I don't know yet. But when the time comes, I want to have a choice." Something flickered across his face, something she couldn't quite identify. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, with a sigh, he leaned back against the bench, looking up at the stars the way she had been moments before. "You think you're the only one who wants a choice," he muttered. Mariel turned to him fully now, watching him carefully. "You have everything. Money, privilege, connections. What choice do you think you don't have?" Ted let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Everything's already decided for me. What school I'll go to, what company I'll run, what kind of life I'm supposed to have. Even this marriage, it wasn't my choice, just another deal my parents made for their own convenience. Do you know what it's like to have your entire future mapped out before you even get a say in it?" Mariel studied him, her mind shifting. She had always assumed that because he was rich, because he came from power, he had control. But she realized now that he had been just as much a pawn in this arrangement as she had. The difference was that he had never learned how to fight against it, while she had spent her whole life surviving. "So what do you want?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Ted was silent for a long time. Then he shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe the same thing you do." They sat there in silence, two people who had spent years resenting each other, only to realize that they weren't so different after all. For the first time, Mariel saw Ted as more than just the boy she had been forced to marry. He wasn't just an obstacle in her life. He was trapped too. And maybe, just maybe, they could find a way out together. Mariel had spent years believing that she and Ted were enemies, two people forced into an arrangement that neither of them wanted. But something had shifted after that night in the garden. It wasn't an immediate change, nor was it dramatic, but it was there, an unspoken understanding that they were both prisoners of the same system, trapped by expectations they had never agreed to. Their interactions became less tense, their conversations less filled with barbed remarks. Ted still had his arrogance, and Mariel still had her quiet defiance, but now there was something else, a familiarity, a shared burden that neither of them could deny. One afternoon, as Mariel sat in the library, immersed in a book on global economics, she heard the door open and knew without looking that it was Ted. He had started coming in more often, sometimes sitting across from her, other times simply wandering the aisles as if trying to find something, though he never said what. Today, however, he didn't pretend to be looking for a book. Instead, He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, resting his elbows on the table. "You never stop, do you?" he mused, watching as she underlined a passage in the book with a pencil. Mariel didn't look up. "Stop what?" "This," he said, gesturing toward the book. "Studying. Learning. Preparing for something. But what exactly are you preparing for?" She finally lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes. "For the day when I'm no longer stuck here." Ted leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "And how do you plan on making that happen?" Mariel hesitated. She had never spoken her thoughts aloud before, but something about the way he was looking at her made her want to. "Your parents think I'm nothing. A placeholder, a girl they could marry off to you because I wouldn't be a threat. They believe that I'll always be the same powerless girl they brought here years ago." Ted tilted his head slightly. "And you're saying you won't be?" She gave a small, knowing smile. "I'm saying they underestimate me." For a moment, Ted said nothing, but there was something in his eyes, something that looked almost like admiration. Then, to her surprise, he smirked. "I think I'd actually like to see that." Mariel narrowed her eyes. "See what?" "You proving them wrong," he said simply. She studied him carefully, searching for sarcasm, but for once, there was none. He was serious. A strange silence stretched between them, neither of them looking away. It was the first time Mariel realized that Ted, for all his wealth and privilege, wasn't just tolerating her presence anymore. He was intrigued by her, maybe even impressed. And for the first time, she wondered if he might actually be on her side. The next few weeks changed everything. Their once hostile dynamic shifted into something neither of them quite understood. They still argued, still pushed each other's buttons, but there was something else now, something closer to camaraderie. Ted started joining her in the library more often, sometimes asking about the books she read, other times challenging her with questions that forced her to think differently. He never openly admitted it, but Mariel could tell he enjoyed their debates, the way they pushed each other in ways no one else did. One evening, they found themselves alone in the study, reviewing a business strategy book Mariel had been reading. Ted leaned over the table, pointing at a diagram in the book. "This is outdated," he remarked. "The market doesn't work like this anymore." Mariel raised an eyebrow. "And you think you know better?" Ted smirked. "I know I do." She rolled her eyes but couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. "Prove it, then." He did. And to her surprise, she enjoyed the way he explained things, the way he challenged her without condescension. By the time the clock struck midnight, Mariel realized something unsettling. She didn't hate Ted Winslow anymore. And worse, she didn't think he hated her either. Mariel never imagined that the boy she once despised would become the only person in the Winslow estate she could truly talk to. What had started as resentment, then evolved into rivalry, had slowly transformed into something unexpected, understanding. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was no longer hostility either. It was something in between, something unspoken, something that neither of them dared to define. Their evenings in the library became routine. They no longer sat in silence, pretending the other didn't exist. Now, they talked, sometimes about business, sometimes about books, and sometimes about things they had never shared with anyone else. Mariel learned that Ted, despite his arrogance, had never wanted the life his parents had planned for him. He felt suffocated by their expectations, trapped by a future that had been decided before he even understood what it meant to have choices. One evening, as they sat in the library, Ted closed his book and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, serious, contemplative, almost vulnerable. "You ever think about what you'd do if you could leave?" he asked. Mariel hesitated, then nodded. "All the time." Ted leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "I don't even know what I'd do. I've spent my whole life being told what I'm supposed to become. Sometimes I think if I walked away, I wouldn't even know who I am." Mariel studied him, realizing that for all his confidence, for all his privilege, he was just as lost as she had been when she first arrived. "You'd figure it out," she said quietly. "Because for the first time, it would be your choice." Ted looked at her then, his blue eyes unreadable. "And you? What would you do?" Mariel exhaled, considering her answer. "I'd go to university. Study business, maybe law. Build something for myself. Not because someone gave it to me, but because I earned it." Ted smirked, but there was no mockery in it. "You sound like someone who's going to be dangerous one day." Mariel tilted her head. "Why?" "Because I won't let your family keep me in this cage forever." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached forward, closing the book in front of her. "No," he said finally. "Because one day, you're going to be smarter than all of them. And that's going to scare the hell out of them." For the first time, Mariel saw something in Ted that she never expected: genuine respect. It wasn't pity, it wasn't condescension, it wasn't the dismissive arrogance she had grown used to. It was real. She wasn't sure when it happened, but she no longer looked at Ted and saw an enemy. She no longer saw the spoiled, entitled boy who had once told her she didn't belong here. Somewhere along the way, he had started to listen. He had started to see her, not as an outsider, but as someone who challenged him, someone who understood what it meant to be trapped, even in a different way. And then, one night, everything changed. It was late, later than usual, and they were the only ones still awake in the estate. The fire in the library crackled softly as Mariel stood by the bookshelves, running her fingers along the spines of the books. She could feel Ted's gaze on her, but she didn't turn around. "You know, if you ever did leave," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "I think I'd miss you." She froze for a second before slowly turning to face him. Ted wasn't smirking. He wasn't teasing. He looked serious, like he had just admitted something he hadn't meant to say out loud. Mariel's heart pounded in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "You'd be fine," she said, keeping her voice steady. Ted shrugged. "Maybe. But it wouldn't be the same." A silence stretched between them, heavier than any argument they had ever had. Something had shifted, something neither of them could take back. Mariel had spent years thinking she was alone in this place. But for the first time, she wasn't so sure. Because for the first time, Ted Winslow wasn't just someone she was forced to be with. He was someone she didn't want to lose. This story is not just about an arranged marriage or two children forced into a life they never wanted. It's about resilience, identity, and the power of choice. From the beginning, Mariel is trapped in a world that sees her as insignificant, a pawn in a game she never agreed to play. But instead of accepting her fate, she fights, quietly at first, through knowledge, through defiance, through proving that she is more than what they believe her to be. What makes this ending so powerful is that Mariel and Ted's relationship doesn't follow a traditional arc of love or romance. It's built on survival, on shared struggles, and on realizing that they are both trapped in different ways. Their hatred turns to rivalry, rivalry turns to understanding, and understanding turns into something neither of them expected. Ted's growth is just as important. He begins as everything Mariel resents: privileged, entitled, dismissive. But as he watches her carve out a place for herself in a world designed to keep her small, he starts to respect her, even admire her. He doesn't pity her, he sees her as an equal, something no one else ever did. And that's what makes their connection real. By the end, the real victory isn't in romance or wealth, it's in the fact that Mariel has changed her story. She is no longer the girl who was chosen because she was weak. She is the woman who has turned her weakness into power. She is no longer just Ted Winslow's wife, she is someone who can stand beside him, not because she has to, but because she chooses to. And in the end, that's what this story is really about. Not love, not revenge, but the right to decide your own future.